Yo,
All
but
right.
just to start off,
Yeah.
thank you very much for accepting the interview request. Because like I had a list of people that I was like, okay, by the end of the year, I'd like to have spoken to these people, and I still have to get through some because I've spoken to Zizi Paul, I've
Yes.
spoken to Jamila, and I've also spoken to Angel Lyric,
Yes.
and with that, most of them were on the Slam platform. Well, they were all on the Slam platform, and
Yeah.
also, do work on the side that is not Slam related, where it's just like, this is poetry for the people, or poetry as music.
Yes.
Yeah, so I was like, it would be great if I spoke to you, even if it's the last one for the year. Like, it would
That
be
would be an
really
honor.
great. So thank you very much for accepting the interview request.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so you have a lot under your belt, but like I want to know, like, writer, spoken word, poet, scholar, editor, translator, like you have all these titles under you. But like when you sit down and think to yourself, like, who is Raphael?
Yeah. Oh, I'm a writer. That's that's
Yeah,
that's the umbrella term. I mean, that's what I do. I write, and
yeah,
that's why you might like break it down into different types of activities that I do, but ultimately that's what I do as a writer. I do all these different things. I translate. I write for for the stage. I write for journals. I edit. So I do research. So I'm a writer. I even say it in a poem.
yeah.
And that's why I don't ever call myself a poet. I let other people do it if they want to. But
Uh-huh.
if you ask me, my answer will be I'm a writer.
Is there any reason why you don't call yourself a poet? Why do you leave it up to the people to give you the label?
Yeah, first of all, because that's how it works for me. You have to be like acknowledged by others as a poet,
Hmm.
particularly by poets, by real
Yeah.
poets. That's the first time I heard a poet that I looked up to calling me as such. I thought like, wow, maybe I am one. So for me, it
Hmm.
doesn't have to come from me. I'm not the one that has to define myself as a poet. And
As
also
a poet.
the other reason is because I think too many people call themselves poets in the world where I live. And so, I want
Mhm.
to also not be associated to that kind of um, way of, being a poet. It's too easy
Yeah.
um, to be a
Uh-huh.
poet, I think, in this country in many ways. Too many people call themselves as such. So let me, take a break from that, take a distance from that, and call myself a writer. And also, there's this
Uh-huh.
saying by this Italian philosopher Benedetto Croce. He says after the age of 15, only two type of people keep writing poetry: idiots and poets. So, in order to avoid any danger, I call myself a writer. You know.
You call yourself a writer. I see that. I see that. And like at what point then, like before 15, did you start writing? Before the transition to either poet or idiot? Like when did you start writing?
I've never gotten out of the idiot phase, but uh, I didn't start writing that early, particularly poetry. I start writing in general as a researcher or as a short story writer. That's how I began with creative writing. My first
Hmm.
pieces were short stories, maybe around the age of 20 or even later. And as a poet, I'm even more of a late bloomer because I only started writing poetry when I arrived here in South Africa. So we're talking
Wow.
about 2008. I started literally scribbling my first shitty poems. So I would say maybe around 2010, 2011 is when I started writing my first good or not too bad poems. So
Uh-huh.
I'm a beginner. I've been doing it only for maybe 15 years or less, which is
Uh-huh.
just the beginning of the journey, for a writer, as you know.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. I really thought you started writing poetry like earlier on, because I mean, 15 years is a long time to become seasoned, but I really thought, you had been doing it for a long time. If you started writing poetry like around 2008, when did you start performing?
Well, good question, because it took me a while, and it's funny. It's a funny story because I arrived here because I was compiling a book on South African spoken word poetry. So I collected an anthology in 2007, 2008 with all the old school poets that I met when I first arrived here. I'm talking about people like Flo Mokale, Afura Khan, Napo Mashiane, Natalia Molebazzi, and a number of them, Sabata Mpomokai, those guys that were active in the spoken word circuit at the time when I arrived. And so
Mhm.
because I was in those spaces all the time, particularly at that time, there was a bar called Horror Cafe in Newtown
Oh yeah.
that used to host all these open mics, etc. So they thought that I was a poet myself, and at that time I was not at all. I was just a researcher, editor. I was putting together this book. So they sort of expected me to perform, and I tried as much as I could to avoid that at the very beginning, because also you didn't only have to perform, you had to perform next to these giants. So I only
Yeah.
started maybe after 2 years. I sneaked for 2 years, and then I started reading. I remember there was Shara Books in Newtown still,
Mhm.
and they organized open mics, and that was the first time that I shared my work in public, and it was so bad that I don't even want to think about it now. But as usual, your first poems are always bad, so it's okay. That's where you start.
Like how bad could it have possibly been? Like, did you walk off the stage or walk away from the mic and somebody was like, "Hey, Raphael, I don't know how to tell you this, but
No,
maybe this is not for you."
no, the performance wasn't that bad. I mean, people like cheered, snap, snap, blah, blah, blah. So the performance
Yeah.
itself was so to speak, well received. But what I'm saying is that if I look back at those poems that I read that time, uh, it was absolute crap. It's something that I don't even want to look at now. But at the
Yeah.
time, I thought they were good to share. But we change, we evolve, we get better, hopefully. And so that
Yeah.
was, as I say, when you start, obviously you never, you're always an amateur, and then you learn.
Yeah.
But what helped
Yeah.
me was to literally have these people in front of me and learning from them, not only what it meant to write a strong piece for performance, but also how to deliver it. It was amazing to see these guys at,
Yeah.
at play. You know who I'm talking
Yeah.
about. Yeah.
Yeah. And like in terms of that, in terms of building your, I don't want to call it an onstage persona because I feel like Raphael is Raphael wherever he goes, like whether you're off stage or on stage, like it's just Raphael. Like how long did it take to become, this person that's just like, I'm not going to memorize my poem. I'm just going to read it off the paper, like there was no pressure on you
Yeah.
to be like, let me memorize it. How long did that take you to be that comfortable?
Good question. Thank you for that. Number one, I don't come from the slam scene. When I started,
Hmm.
slam didn't exist. I mean, there were minor little slam events, but it wasn't a culture. It wasn't a movement as it is now. I'm talking again about 2007, 2008. So I never,
Hmm.
and if it had been there, I would have probably not even joined it, because I never saw poetry as a form of competition. So I developed my
Hmm.
persona, as you call it rightfully, stage persona. First of all, looking at what the other people were doing, and then for me, the point is always not to repeat that, to create something
Yeah.
that is different. So everybody was memorizing their poems. I'm like, okay, I'm reading from the page. Everybody was like
Hmm.
using a certain style of delivery, and then I like, okay, I have to develop something different. Otherwise, I wouldn't be noticed. If you
Yeah.
deliver in the way that other people do, if you look at that generation, you have people like Lebo Mashile, you have people like Afuragan, you have people like
Hmm.
Flo, Prophet JD was a big performer back then. I don't even want to try and be and sound like that, because I mean they are doing it already much better than what I could possibly do. And so I try to, you know, create a different style so that people, when I'm on stage, they say, oh, that's something new, different.
Yeah. And it really is, because the first time I saw you was at Word and Sound, I think in 2013. This
Okay.
was at the Con Cohen Theater.
Oh, yes.
So on that night, Philippa was also performing. You were also on the lineup, and that was the first time I saw you. I was like, and Afura's like, okay, we have an Italian poet. I'm like, who's the Italian poet that's not Dante? You know, who is this guy that's not Dante? And you got on stage and it was just like, okay, you're just sitting down and you are going to read. You know, I was like, wow, this is a really a new experience, because when I started poetry around 2011,
Yes.
I started writing poetry in 2010, but that was just for the page, and I had
Yes.
been rapping before that.
Yes.
And then when I got into the poetry scene, it was slam, 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 slam. And then I get to the festival, or it was the show before the festival.
Yes.
Just like, okay, Philippa is getting on stage. She's just relaxed. She's chilled. Raphael, you get onto stage and you also relaxed and you chilled. And it was just like, wow, I didn't know this is something that we can do. All I assumed was that we get on stage, we, you know, recite these poems, we fight for the points.
Yes.
You know, so it was a really refreshing experience watching you for the first time.
Thank
Like,
you.
and I still remember it, because I was like, the Italian poet.
And likewise, because now you say, you know, you started as a slam, and I remember you as one of those like acts that, you know, impressed me, because remember, I was also attending these slam sessions just also for my research purposes. It's a space that I'm being studying, right? Not just trying to understand what happens in the slam spaces, but I've been studying it. And so I observe carefully what happens, you know, in under all the different aspects. And so, yeah, of course, when in a space like that, someone like Philippa and I, you know, go on stage, obviously we offer something different. It's also a matter of age, to be honest, you know. I mean, we are much older than you guys. And if I come out and I'm like, you know, going like all the way Fast and Furious, like screaming, it would sound a bit pathetic, I think. You know, it's you guys are young, you have energy, you have a different stamina. It's a different way of delivering that also is also, you know, connected to who you are in your life journey. So we are more chilled, I think. It's fine.
Yeah, like it was really amazing. And even now, like when I was sitting down just thinking about it, I was like, what was my first encounter with Raphael? Like it was that stage performance, but then I think after that I didn't speak with you for like a very long time.
Yes.
But I don't remember the first conversation we have. I just know that whatever happened, it was on Facebook. I was just like, okay, you know, I'm now friends with like a really big writer. And like the early days of Facebook for me were like, hey, if Raphael can accept my friend request,
oh,
you know.
I remember we having a gig together on a rooftop gig on the 16th of June some years ago.
Yeah.
And I remember you and your girlfriend we came with the school uniform, and you performed in the school uniform, and it was amazing. It was like, again, a very big lineup. Nomashenga was there, Flo Mokale, Quaz. And I remember you with, you know, I already knew you as a poet, but I remember that the outfit, it was definitely something that brought something more to that. I don't know if you remember that gig. It was in Joburg.
I remember it very well.
Yeah. That's when I think you and I kind of shared the stage for the first time.
For the first time.
Yeah. And you know I hate that expression, but let's not go there. You know, we shared the stage of that day. Yeah.
It's like so that event was organized by I think Leon.
Exactly.
Leon Erasmus.
By Leon Erasmus. Yes. Because
he
had a
he
studio. He had a
that
studio
session
in the same building downstairs, and then he organized the gig in that beautiful rooftop with those hills in the background. It was amazing, actually.
Yeah, it was really great. I struggled getting there a little bit. I had to walk
Yeah.
from MTN, from the taxi rank, and you know, when you have to walk from places like that, the heart
Yes.
rate really goes up, you know.
It was in a bit
And
of a dodgy
when you
place.
get
I
to
remember
the
that
get to
too, but you know,
yeah.
I like to be doing
Yeah.
poetry in those spaces, to be honest, you know. I've been doing poetry in
Mhm.
so many different spaces, from like, you know, Renaissance buildings in Italy to, you know, dingy bars,
Yeah.
you know, anywhere. And to be honest, I prefer to be in a space where I'm, you know, close to people who are not even necessarily, you know, related to poetry. If you remember the audience for that gig, they were just guys there drinking
Yeah.
beer on the roof, who were like
Yeah.
looking at us as if we were Martians. They didn't even know there was a poetry event there, but I liked it, and they got hooked into the poetry that we were doing. Oh,
Yeah.
it was cool.
Yeah, that was a really cool experience. And now that you bring up Italy, like I'd like to know like which poetry scene
Yeah.
do you like more, or which poetry scene and is more mature in your eyes? Like which scene do you like more, and which one has grown the most from your eyes?
So you mean the Italian comparison between the Italian and the South African?
And the South African, yeah.
Oh, well, first of all, I don't belong to the Italian one. I've never been an Italian poet, so I don't even
Oh
want to
yeah.
have anything to do with that, because it's not particularly exciting for me. Although I
Hmm.
have like very good friends who are amazing poets, and I've been collaborating with them. Especially this year, we started a more formal collaboration with two poets of my age. Um,
Hmm.
Elisa Donzelli, she's the director of a very famous series in Italy of the publishing house that she's running, and she's
Hmm.
basically collecting like the works of the people of my generation. So there are people who are doing interesting things, and I do work with them. But apart from that,
Hmm.
I'm completely cut off from that scene. As I say, I don't really think it's really exciting for me. I'm not an Italian poet, so when I approach
Yeah.
that scene, I'm a South African poet. I define myself as South African.
Yeah.
So on top of that, if you ask me my experience around the world, man, we have the best poetry community in the world here. I'm telling you,
Yeah.
the average level of the poetry spaces is really high, really high.
Uh-huh.
That's why, you know, for instance, Abiza went to the slam and he destroyed
Hmm.
everyone. The
Yeah.
word final. I don't know. I saw I saw the event from beginning to end, and it was no game. It was just like
Yeah.
5 levels above everyone else.
Yeah. And
Including, there was
he was
also an
just going there
Italian.
to
Yeah, in that final.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I didn't get a chance to watch the final, but just watching the bits afterwards, I was like, hey, like once you have a South African poet on stage, hey, it's over for everyone, especially with the slam.
And with my usual polemical, you know, way of putting things, years ago, before she became famous, I came across Amanda Gorman, you know, the
Uh-huh.
youth poet laureate, the one who did the reading for Biden at the inauguration. So I came
Hmm.
across her long before she became famous, and I posted something along the lines of, if she was the national youth poet laureate of the US
Yeah.
at that stage. So I'm like, okay, she's
Hmm.
supposed to be the best young poet in the US. Let me see what she does. And I wrote a post saying, if Amanda Gorman comes to a slam in South Africa, she wouldn't pass the first round,
Yeah.
because that's what I thought. You know, I still think so.
Uh-huh.
Even now that she's famous, she wouldn't pass around probably.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
how good
definitely. Like
that's how good you guys are here. Yeah.
uh-huh. And like what is your perception of like slams in general? Like how do you feel about slams? Would you like at some point be like, okay, if there's a slam for your generation and they like, okay, we're bringing in everybody from there, would you join the slam?
Okay, another very good question, because it makes me think about how slam was born. I don't know if you know the
Mhm.
origins of slam. You know how it was really born. It was Mark Kelly Smith, Ellen Equi, Patricia Smith. Those were like writers in Chicago. right?
Yeah.
And they were bored about the poetry scene in the city and elsewhere. And they thought about, let's invent a formula that can spice up these poetry events. And before they even call it
Yeah.
slam, I think they were literally called poetry fights, where they would be on a ring with gloves, and they would dramatize like a poetry bout, a poetry fight. And from then, they invented the slam formula that we know. But they were writers before they started doing slam, right? So now, because of the way slam developed, things have changed. Now the people who enter the slam space are, approaching poetry for the first time, unlike, the inventors of slam. And so things have changed. So obviously I don't ever see myself possibly being part of a slam. But, if he was done in the way that, it was done at the origins, where like old school writers would meet and just have fun, in that case, I would definitely, give it a shot. But after all, I love slam. I really love slam. I'm critical of some of the things that I see, but again, because as I say, I'm studying what happens there. But in general, I love it. I'm #1 fan of slam. Really.
Yeah. How do you feel about judging slams? Because I imagine it's a different experience if you're just watching the slam and enjoying the show, and actually judging. Like how was that experience?
Yeah, I mean,
If you have judged any shows.
Oh, I've judged many, including a Poetry Africa slam final, Word and Sound finals, Hear My Voice, Trying to Speak Out Loud. So I've judged all the major platforms in South Africa. But I also developed, I learned how to do it, because initially I was extremely strict, because I was looking at the things that I wanted to see in the poets, right? They had to, sound in a certain way for me, write in a certain way. But then I started to think about, what's really my role there. And I started to take into account other aspects that maybe were not important for me, but they were important for the performers and the audiences. So obviously, as you know, it's always a combination of different factors. It's writing, it's delivery, it's the content, it's the writing style, it's the audience response. So you have to look at all these different aspects before you start really thinking about how to score a slam. And I think, after years of experience, I think I can definitely have a look at slam poetry, for the first time, and then be able to judge it fairly for the performers. I hope.
I see that. Like I think on my side, I've judged like a couple of slams, like very, very few slams. And in the slams that I've judged, like I didn't enjoy the process. I was just like, I'd like to just be an audience member, I don't want to be the person putting, the points on the sheet, because at the end of the day, when somebody doesn't make it, you know how in slam poetry, like we always fight about, the judges, there's a problem with the judges.
Always.
And I was just
always.
like, every time. So I was just like, I'd much rather, just watch, the show, enjoy it. And if anybody wants to speak about their poem afterwards, they can come up to me and, we'll talk about it. So
absolutely. It's a responsibility for the judge. So, and that eventually a lot of people will not agree with what the judges have decided. And here in South Africa, the rule is that the slams are judged by other poets, that the panel is always poets, usually, while only occasionally you leave the audience to be the judge, which is what happens in the US. In the US, most commonly, the judge is just the crowd. And to me, I prefer the South African style, because there is a little bit of quality control, at least. At least you're judged by poets. I remember, because one time that, I don't remember even if it was in Pretoria, Joburg, but it was one of these slams where they allowed the audience to be the judge. And Kateko Mazinga was there, great writer, alongside other slammers, and she didn't even pass the first round. And I'm like, and she delivered probably the best poem in the first round. So I'm like, again, a confirmation of what I think, that if Yeah, obviously the audience response is important. It's very important, but it has to be only one criteria for me. It can't be the only criteria, because otherwise I've seen it happen too often that very good writers don't get rewarded by the audience. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, like when it makes me really nervous every time somebody's like, okay, the audience is going to be the judge, just like you know. And sometimes if you know your opponent, you know it's highly likely that they're going to win despite the content, and you know that even if you're the stronger performer, but because you know they know how to do their thing with the audience, it's like, okay, it's over for you.
Well, you know, the times where I got the most irritated with slam, it was when I think it hit rock bottom for me, when you had really strong performers, which you always have, but their work was so saturated, so you know, so well like studied, that it was really all about the performance, and it was well calculated to please the audience, which is, I mean, it's what slammers do. I mean, you want to win the competition, but that at some point took over. So, and the writing was really in the background, and it was bad. Yet there were poets that were winning slams just because they had studied how to win the audience, you know, the audience heart. So, you know, unfortunately, I think that with slams is like ups and downs. Sometimes you have periods where the strong writers emerge. Sometimes you have the periods where the performers emerge, you know. So you have to just keep an eye and see who's there in the scene at the moment.
Nah, definitely.
Your generation
like,
was of strong writers.
Yeah. Like I think though the one thing that pushed me a lot to write is that I think that first Word and Sound session that I went to in 2011, that really gave me an idea of, you know, the type of content that should be going out. Because on the stage there was Poetic Butterfly, Matebula, there was Masai Tabula, Bonga, like, and
Nova, I think Nova was also in that group, Nova Mashango.
Yeah, right? Nova joined later, towards the end of the year. Yeah, but like that first session that I went to, like that just blew me away, because I was like, okay, there's really strong writing here. There are amazing things you can do with words beyond rap. You know, there are amazing things that you can do. Because my approach was always that, okay, punchline, you know, the punchline is the important thing. But then when I heard Masai reciting sentiments with faces, he gave his emotions personalities. I was just like, wow, this is an amazing thing to do with words. You know, this is very good writing. Like I'm only in grade 11, but I'm like, I can try to do something like that. And the following month I went and performed. I was like, okay, this is a good stepping stone. So the writing, like I was really pushed by the writers from when I started. And like, now that we're speaking about writing, like I'd like to go into, you know, into speaking about writing. Like, what in your eyes makes a strong writer? Like, what makes a good writer, and what defines good writing for you?
You have to be a good reader. You have to be you know, obsessed reader. You have to read as much as possible. You have to read as widely as possible. And that for me is just giving yourself a chance to be a writer. If you don't read, forget about it. Just forget about it. You can't develop your writing skills if you don't read. So what makes a writer is, first of all, you have to be a reader, because it's like in music, right? Who are the most imaginative musicians? Let's talk about rap or hip hop, right? It's being a good hip hop artist is because you know what has been done before. You know funk, you know soul, you know rock and roll, you know all these genres that eventually, you know, were channeled into what we know as hip hop. So if you want to be a good hip hop artist, then you have to know what other people have done before you. Same with literature. You know, you have to know where poetry comes from, just to be able to possibly imagine where is it going. And once you
Let it
have
go.
that kind
Yeah.
of imagination, you can try and put it into words. But without that background, you are lost as a writer. What do you like cling to if it's not the writing that
If it's
other
not.
people have done?
Yeah. And like, so talking about being a good reader, because this is something I knew would come up, because I know you're a very big critic of writers who don't read, you know. And
You
it's
can't
like,
be a writer for me.
yeah, yeah. Because like I want to know then, like there's somebody on Facebook, there's a post I saw where he's a rapper. He
Yeah.
said that he doesn't read, right? So this guy said he doesn't read, but like he manages to write he's a really good writer.
Yeah.
And he was like, he manages to write mostly by listening to other rappers, you
That's
know.
fine.
And I was just like, does that also fall into like into reading? Can reading also be listening to other artists?
I mean, okay, listening obviously is very important. Let's say you are a poet and you listen or you watch YouTube videos, and that helps you in terms of like listening to the rhythm,
Yeah.
developing an ear for poetry, for the rhythm and the music of poetry. But then again, that's only one aspect of it. When you start putting that stuff on paper, and you know how you are a much better writer than I am, and I can write a rap song, you know, I've done it for playing. But you know, you work with bars, you work with rhythm, you work with, you know, a certain tempo. I mean, if you don't put that on paper, you're not going to go beyond a certain level as a writer, right? On top of that, if you don't know what other people have written before, are you not sure that you're not gonna repeat something that has already been done? So one reason why you have to read is because you have to know what has been done and you have to offer something new and fresh.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's difficult.
All right.
You know, so
yeah,
it's not negotiable. You can't be a writer without even engaging with writing. Obviously, listening is important, but it can't work only with that.
Yeah. There's another layer that has to be added to it. I see that.
Absolutely.
What literature inspired you mostly as a writer, not even just as a poet? And I'm calling you a poet. Like, what literature influenced you in your writing journey?
I mean, the influences are so many. I can't even like start mentioning, you know, obviously I would start talking about writers that have inspired me, but there are so many I can't even start. But if we narrow it down to poetry, to be honest, what fueled me to pick up the pen and start writing poetry was the South African spoken word scene. I had obviously read poetry before. I was like a poetry reader. I loved the Romantics. That was one of my first influence, right? Wordsworth, Coleridge, etc. I love that. But the one school of poetry that made me want to explore poetry was the South African spoken word scene, definitely. And I always like say I'm a product of that. Without that experience, I would have probably never have written poetry, you know. And then as a writer, it's if you talk about prose, it's a different story, you know. But as a poet, it was definitely that scene that influenced me the most.
Yeah. And so you say prose is another thing entirely. So what is the difference between poetry and prose for you? Like when you're judging a slam, for instance, or when you're reading a piece of work, like, and you're like, okay, this is not poetry, maybe it's prose. You know, what makes the distinction for you? Because also thinking about the poem that you shared earlier, the one that I think I liked it or commented also on it, because I was like, okay, you know, people will be like, oh, it's not poetry, it's prose.
Oh, the
But
one
it's like,
by Carlos Williams.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So obviously, it's a very difficult question that is still an open question. What distinguishes poetry from prose? So many people have given different explanations, but number one for me, let's say when I look at poetry and what makes me like think that is good poetry or not, the one element that distinguishes poetry from prose is the economy of language. So poetry compared to prose has to be stripped to the bone for me in terms of the use of language. So even obviously, even literature, even prose when it's overwritten is bad prose. But that comes up even more clearly in poetry. When poetry is overwritten, when you don't pay attention to be economical with your language, that's for me when poetry become prosaic in the bad sense of the word. Because poetry can be prose. A lot of my poems are prose-like. But there is always an element of like deviation of the language somewhere there that makes it a poem. And even if in long narrative poems, the rule number one is that it still has to be very, very economic in its use of words and in its choice of words. So the main difference for me is that the sustained focus on the economy of language.
All right. That makes a lot of sense. Because I'm just thinking about how I even shared something where I was like, I felt like a lot of what I had written was prose. But then when I go back to evaluate and, look at the whole thing is structured, that's when I realized that this is poetry. Nobody can tell me any different. Even if you come along and say, this isn't poetry, it's prose. Like,
exactly.
You can't decide for me. Like I've written poetry, and if I deliver it, nobody in the audience or somebody listening is going to say, oh, that was a very beautiful prose that you just read. So it's just like, okay, reevaluate my work and see where I started to feel like it was prose, and then realize, no, this was poetry that I've been writing this entire time.
Exactly. And that's where the reading is essential, because when you read poetry, your eyes and you read it aloud, of course, because that's how poetry is supposed to be read. You get attuned to the silences and the pose that the poet is using, even if it's a narrative poem. So that's why also reading is essential for you to develop a writing style that can be prosaic to the unexperienced reader or listener, but it's poetry to the experienced reader or listener. You understand what I'm saying? And then that there is obviously in a space where people are not so experienced readers, or their exposure to poetry is not that wide, you tend to judge poetry in terms of, as you say, punchlines or the numbers of like metaphors that are delivered in a poem. But that's again, it's an amatorial way of seeing poetry if the only thing you look at is that the experienced poet can hear a good poem even if it sounds prosaic.
Nah, definitely. And with all this talk about poems, would you mind delivering a poem for us?
Okay. Yeah, I haven't prepared, but let me read one. Since we're talking about this issue of calling yourself a poet and also prose versus poetry, I'm gonna read one poem that speaks about that. It's a sort of like a CV. It's called By Your Notes. If I find it, By Your Notes. Yeah. By Your Notes. Raphael D'Abdon is a writer. Sometimes he writes poems. His stage name is Raphael D'Abdon. He has published 3 collections of poems that very few bought, and even fewer read. Some of his poems have been published in journals and magazines. Many more have been rejected, 2 of them by the New Yorker. He has performed in a few countries, but then again, too few to mention. He has shared the stage and bars with carpenters, electricians, cleaners, scenographers, and sound engineers. He has won 1 obscure literary prize and 0 slams. If you invite him for a reading and he doesn't pitch, don't worry. You could get a poet with a more impressive CV anywhere.
Wow.
I call it
There's
an anti-CV poem,
an
where I celebrate my failures.
yeah, quite humorous as well.
Yeah, well, that's another thing. I try to be humorous,
Yeah.
which I think it's something missing in our poetry
Hmm.
scene. So then
Yeah.
again, if you see me, maybe I'm offering something that you don't expect, which is humor on stage.
Yeah, like we're definitely going to laugh.
You know, not all the time, but why not? I mean, poetry must explore all aspects
Yeah.
of life.
And like there's something you mentioned in the poem, like you've shared stages and bars with electricians and you know electricians, technicians, and all these people, which brings me back to something that you've said before, like about writers that you know poetry. You were like these aren't your exact words, but it was something along the lines of poetry won't be the only place that you get your income from. There are many other things that poets do
Yes,
aside from writing, you
exactly.
know. And I was like, it's a really powerful statement, because sometimes you just sit there, you're like, okay, I'm a poet, and what else? Or
Yeah,
what am I before I'm a poet? And sometimes I usually just jest when I speak to people, because I worked as a journalist,
yes,
and now I'm a teacher. And I always tell people that I'm neither of these things. I'm not a poet. I'm not a journalist. I'm not a teacher. I'm a carpenter. Because I come from a
yes.
family of carpenters. We all work in carpentry. So I'm just like, okay, I'm a carpenter before I'm anything else. And when I read that post, I just thought about this. I was like, there are many things you can be before you just like, I'm a poet. Poetry is what I'm doing. Poetry is my
Absolutely.
work.
Absolutely. And that
Yeah.
line in particular, obviously, it was a sort of like parody of people, putting in their CV, oh, I shared a stage with Lebo
Yeah.
Mashila. That makes me cool, which I
Yeah.
hate. And they explained to me that it's good because when you mention in your CV that you have shared a stage with such and such, it boosts your profile. I'm like, okay, whatever.
Uh-huh.
But in that line, I wanted to pay tribute also to the people that work with us, around us when we go on stage, but
Hmm.
they go, they are uncelebrated. When you're on stage,
Yeah.
somebody has set up the microphone for you, someone has set up the scenography for you, someone has cleaned that stage for you. So those are the people I
Hmm.
want to celebrate in this poem. Those are the people I'm
Yeah.
proud to have shared the stage with, not you know the big names. Not that I'm
Just
not proud
yeah.
of, but I don't think it's something that will make me feel a better poet if I tell you, oh, I shared the stage with Sonia Sanchez. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Nah, definitely. I hear that. And like we've got like 10 minutes before we round off. And
yes.
like I'd just like to like get into the Shakespeare, get into the Shakespeare. And like what was the turning point where you realized that okay, maybe Shakespeare is something I'm into. I'm getting older, or is it something that comes with age? Like, is it because you're getting older that you're into Shakespeare, or is it just like, okay, he's a good writer, I should have paid attention before?
No, another good question. I mean, we know that the common experience with Shakespeare is a problematic one because Shakespeare is
Hmm.
taught in schools from a very early age, is taught in university, and in those schools, I'm a teacher also, like you. I teach
Hmm.
in a college, and I teach Shakespeare. But we know that in general, both at school and at university, poetry, not just Shakespeare, is taught in a very unimaginative way with methodologies that don't make students like poetry. So, and poetry
Hmm.
in general. Imagine Shakespeare was not just one of the best poets that ever lived, but one of the most complex as well. So when you sort
Hmm.
of shove down the throat of high school students, a complex poet like Shakespeare, and maybe this operation is done by a teacher who doesn't even know Shakespeare himself or herself, and with the inadequate tools of teaching poetry, that becomes a recipe
Hmm.
for disaster. So myself,
Yeah.
like 90% of people, I had a very bad traumatic experience with poetry in school, and of course I
Hmm.
didn't like Shakespeare. So in my personal experience, it was an Italian actor that revisited Shakespeare with performances that were completely crazy, so to speak. And it was after watching him doing what he was doing with Shakespeare that I started to get interested in Shakespeare again and reread his stuff again with different eyes, you know. And now I love it. I love Shakespeare, and it's been like maybe a 15 years journey of rediscovery of Shakespeare. And I wrote an article recently about this, about my rediscovery of Shakespeare. So, you know, and I think that ultimately, again, as an experienced reader, when you come across Shakespeare and you have the mature eyes to appreciate what he did as a poet, then necessarily you have to love it. You know, you have to love what Shakespeare wrote. Yeah, and in fact, from that article, let me read the poem that speaks about that. It's actually the conclusions of that article. It's the poem titled "Shakespeare Didn't Work for Me Until I Hit My 30s. Too many unschooled teachers telling me how damn good he was, and too many insipid Hollywood versions of his stuff. I found the sonnets ornate, and to be or not to be, that is the question, the weakest line ever. I still do. Reading him was like strolling in a fog-wrapped sunflower field. And it took an Italian buffoon to pull the bard's soul out of the page and unlock the magic. His grunts and ululations, his screams and contortions blew the fog away. And the mad kings, the cunning queens, the wise fools, the blind earls, the smart witches, the horny heiresses, the doomed lovers, the insolent monsters, the airy spirits, and the vengeful ghosts popped up one by one, tap dancing on the sunflowers. Now I'm in my late 40s and it works just fine. I even like the sonnets. Yeah.
That one, it never gets old. Every time I hear it, I'm just like, okay. Because like I've played it a couple of times and I was just like, okay, this is some good stuff. You know, like just having read it, I was just like, okay, this is some really premium stuff. Because
and
like
I'm glad that you young guys appreciate it. It wasn't only you, like you know, were receiving this poem, because the message ultimately is like, you know, obviously I can't prescribe Shakespeare, but the message is don't give up on him. You know, keep it there from the time in your life when you'll be ready to approach him. And when the time comes, you know, the magic will be unlocked and you will appreciate.
Yeah. Like I think this position that like you have on Shakespeare, that, you know, like keep him close, don't discard him. I think people misunderstand me a lot of the time when I say Shakespeare is hard to read. Because like I've picked up Shakespeare, like tried to read the work, and a lot of the time I just find myself being like, this, it's not hard to read in a sense I don't understand, but like it just doesn't, it's really hard to get through everything, hard to get through the story. I'm just like, okay, maybe I'll read this another time. And people always think that I don't like Shakespeare. It's not that. I just feel like there's a point in my life that will come where I'm like, okay, now I'm ready to pick up this book, read it, and finish it.
Absolutely, because we change, and then we engage different with the things we read in different moments of our lives. You know, it happens. Obviously, it applies to the writers that we read, but it applies also to our own poetry. If I look back at what I wrote, not just poetry, your own writing, if I look back at what I wrote 10 or 15 years ago, you know, sometimes I'm not there anymore, so I can't even relate to what I wrote. So the same with the authors that you encounter. You maybe start reading Shakespeare in a moment where in your life where you're not getting into attuned with what he's writing or the way he's writing it. And then maybe you pick up the same book 10 years later, and here it is. You know, you now start to appreciate what he did because you are seeing the same book with different eyes.
Nah, definitely. So before we wrap up, I would like you to tell me, like, I have this thing called the poet sandwich, right? I would like you to make a sandwich using 5 poets. This is in no particular order, but like they are the ingredients to your sandwich. Like, who are these 5 poets for you for a poet sandwich?
Okay, number 1, Lance Sanson, my first mentor, a Cheyenne Native American poet, is the one who made me realize I could write poetry, and is still today my favorite poet to read. So number 1, Lance Sanson. Number 2, definitely I would say Charles Bukowski, because as a young poet, I learned from him that you can use prose effectively and turn it into powerful poetry. Number 3, Patricia Smith, because of how she's able to occupy all the different spaces that she occupies. You know, she was 5 times, I think, Slam national champion in the US, but she's also an academic. She's a essay writer. So she's definitely one poet I look up to. And in this country, I would pay tribute to Maisha Jenkins. So she will be in the sandwich. And from the old times, I would put Omar Khayyam, the author of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. I'm not gonna talk about him, but let's say this way: if I have my pantheon of 5 poets, the pantheon obviously is much bigger, but put those 5 in your sandwich, and it will be a nice tasting sandwich. I promise.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much for that, and also thank you very much for giving me your time.
Thank you.
Like it's like you're a fountain of knowledge. We have you there. Like let's just be like, okay, if we need any to get any advice poetry related, Raphael is there. You know, you're just like this fountain of knowledge when it comes to poetry, and also you have a lot of opinions that, you know, we appreciate. Some of them are unpopular, but you know, they are appreciated.
Thank you.
You know, so thank you very much.
And also thank you, because I'm inspired by you guys. And so the fact that my presence in your space is validated means a lot for me. And to engage with young poets, you know, it really means a lot. So thank you for having me.